All right, if you wouldn't mind starting out with a brief introduction, your name, your title, your credentials.
Yes, my name is Charles Hurburgh. Uh, I'm a former professor of agricultural engineering at Iowa State University. I ran the Grain Quality Initiative until June of this year, and now I'm emeritus professor of agricultural engineering, having retired in June. But my job, so to speak, in extension, I was in extension. In extension was grain handling and grain storage, grain processing. That was my job, and I this year with all the disease pressure, it's brought on some unusual questions, no doubt.
So what we're looking at here this year is the guys that have got it started on harvest early. They're noticing a variation of moistures within a pass. Sometimes upwards of 8 to 10% moisture variation, and then kernel size on the corn has been a large variation, just depending on disease pressure, premature death, all that stuff. Your recommendations on how we handle that, and if we're going into a storage operation, what should we do dealing with that variance in grain? What are things we got to watch for?
Well, first of all, the variance you talked about was probably due to southern rust. At least it is in our area, and I expect it's probably more or less the same where you are located. And that caused in some places in fields that caused premature death, and basically reduced the grain fill. It isn't going to cause moldy corn or anything like that would give storage molds. It's not that type of a disease, but it caused less grain. It slowed the grain fill, which made the kernels, yes, smaller, yes, shallower, less filled out, and therefore softer kernels. That will basically, that's what happened. And it's pretty erratic, depending on where in the field the infections were the heaviest and the lightest. A lot of this came in after most of the dry matter had been deposited, and so it won't have a whole lot of effect on the grain quality necessarily. It may clip, well, it will clip the yield some. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
But whether it arrived early enough to have an effect on the quality of the grain fill, that's highly variable, and that's just what you saw in the field. From a storage perspective, grain handling and storage perspective, the kernels will be a little softer, therefore break a little bit more than they would normally. Expect a little lower test weight than we have had in previous years. The last 2 years have been pretty good on the test weight. We've been running, 57s, even up to 60s in test weight. But probably it'll be centered more around 54 and 55. It's not going to be a disaster because the fungus didn't invade quickly enough to kill the corn in an early stage, like a frost would, for example, that would create terribly light corn and really have a nutritional problem. But I don't think we'll have that. We will have somewhat lower test rates, probably not enough to cause a lot of marketing problems, but users will notice. Users will notice the difference from what they might have been expecting in previous years. Test weight is the biggest indicator of storability that we have, an easy indicator of storability. So we can expect probably a few more storage problems in more tendency for hot spots. We can also expect that it will take a little more gas to dry the grain for the same amount of moisture removed. If you're using gas or artificial drying, because the softer corn will hang on to the moisture a little bit tighter, and it's a little harder to get it out. So I think we'll see longer drying times or more fuel required for drying, maybe 10% more fuel required. It's not a huge thing. This is not a disaster, but at the same time, it will make a difference. And then down the road, that same characteristic, hanging on to water, will make it to where we will have to maintain quality and storage by checking and periodic aeration. We'll have to keep it cool. The key thing right now is get it cool, keep it cool. And then we'll probably be okay into the spring without too many problems. Problems will show up if we have some. The problems will show up in the summer. And obviously, with ethanol being what it is, an ethanol plant needs a 12th of their grain in September, just like they need a 12th of their grain in January. So we'll have to have corn around all year, and it will take a little bit more management. It will take more periodic checking, paying attention to temperature. I shouldn't say temperature, actually, temperature per se, temperature rise. If you see an increase in temperature, even of 2-3 degrees, even if you think it's from 40 to 42 degrees, let's say, or 43 degrees, you say that's cool enough, that's probably okay. But if there's a rise, something is going on. Something caused that. And it's a matter of trends. Pay attention to the trends and act in advance. Also, what you do in the fall, right when you take the grain out of the field, will be more important this year. If we're running a little light on test weight and a little softer kernels, a little more breakage, what we do right away. And what we do is, one, get it cool right out of the field. We're going to have some hot corn coming out of the field. Temperature low. I don't know what the temperature today here in Iowa is not too hot, but it's supposed to get up more in the 70s and 80s, and that'll mean warm grain coming out of the field. Don't let it sit. Don't let it sit. If the air is dry, we've got a pretty low dew point, or we'll have a pretty low dew point, and that is a good time to get grain cold, because the grain will tend to go down to the dew point of the air. If the dew point's 50, let's say 70 or 75 and 50 degree dew points, you'll be able to get the corn cool down to, well, not totally to 50, but it'll be close. And it will be a lot better to store than if it were sitting warm waiting for a dryer. Don't leave your wet corn waiting for a dryer. Cool it down, and then we can pick up on the drying as needed down the road. So getting the grain cool is probably the biggest thing.
Is there a
go ahead.
Is there a time period to that? Is there a time, like say we harvest, it's 75 degrees all day. In the evening, our temperatures are dropping. We kick on the fans. Is that good enough?
Yes, cool it overnight. Yeah, that's good enough. But
okay,
a lot of times in rapid harvest, and goodness knows the harvest is getting faster and faster. Combines aren't getting any smaller, and so we could have several thousand bushels of corn on wheels that automatically sits for a while waiting for the various systems to catch up. Well, try to get it unloaded into a bin with aeration, a wet holding bin with aeration, and get it cool. Then you're okay. You've got a few days to catch up with your drying system and be okay. The other thing that we need to do right away is once you have a bin that is full, peak it up, or that is let it fill up to where it's got a cone to it, upward, and draw it back down. Because the fines, and we'll have a few more fines this year, on account of the little bit lower test weight, lighter corn and softer corn, we'll probably have a few more fines. Not an excessive amount, but a few more. Take the fines out of the bin right away, because that's a source of diverting air to where the air goes up the outside or whatever. Typically the middle is the problem, and not always, but typically if you have a spreader that throws it in a ring that scatters it out in the rain, you tend to get a donut of fines, about a 5 to 10 foot circle right in the middle of the bin where the fines fall. Taking those out will be a big benefit this year, and then just take them out and feed them or whatever you can do with them. But that will help the storability greatly. We do a couple things simple. We probably are going to be okay. That is, this is not a disaster from a crop quality point of view, and it just means it takes a little bit more attention.
That is awesome. When we talk about mechanically drying or artificial drying corn, you said it's probably going to take a little more gas because of the softer kernels.
Just hang on to the water.
Yep. Is there a recommendation you have? We're going to have a variance, right? We're going to have a variance of moistures going through that. Do we want to dry it fast and hot? Do we want to slowly take that moisture out? Does it matter in those instances?
Well, overly fast and hot, like temperatures up well over 200 degrees, probably won't get uniform drying. That is, probably won't dry in the time that it is in the heated air. So I wouldn't turn the heat up. A lot of high temperature dryers, high temperature continuous dryers, run at air temperatures of 180 degrees, 190, depending on the design of the dryer. Some make the grain cooler and others don't, and so it's a little bit dryer specific, but we're somewhere around in there. I would not increase the heat greatly, because if we try to dry it too fast, we'll end up with incompletely dried kernels that will be this. You make a good point here. Moisture meters will read incompletely dried corn low, because the electric moisture meters, the resistance component of the electric moisture meter will tend to read the surface of the kernel, and if that shows as dry, you tend to get a little bit drier reading than the real than the real kahuna, so to speak, and you may end up with 16, 17 in your bin, and you thought, well, I swear I dried that to 15. Well, it might be that it never got completely dry. So don't try to just bake it down quickly. That will just lead to more incomplete drying. And also, drying it long stretches at high temperatures to try to speed things up magnifies the breakage problem. The corn will get more brittle than it otherwise would, and we don't need that. It'll break up enough, of its own natural volition. It's going to break up some, and so let's not try to overheat it and have fast transitions between hot and cold and so forth. In bin cooling will work rather well. That's where you take it out of the dryer hot and put it in a bin and cool it down with the aeration fan. That will work rather well, and as well as increasing the capacity of the dryer. So there are things you can do to not stress it too much. If you're grinding corn for animal feed, a few more broken kernels might not necessarily matter. I mean, if you're grinding your own corn, then it might not matter. But if it goes to a processing use, then it will. And even in ethanol production, whose first task or first operation is grind the corn, but if it's not ground uniformly, if it doesn't grind uniformly, you tend to get variances in fermentation, and the net effect is longer fermentation times, and the ethanol plant capacity goes down. Well, I don't like that. These plants are made to run at rated capacity, so we don't want to over, and there's some evidence to show that the fermentation process is inhibited by overheating. Heating, that's fine, but by overheating, again, somewhere in that 180 degrees range seems to be around, not a limit, but around the sweet spot. Normally the corn won't get that hot because there's evaporative cooling. So normally the corn won't get that hot, and fermentation will take place in a relatively rapid way. But overheating the corn, basically you deactivate the internal enzymes in the corn, and so that will slow down the fermentation. Some ethanol plants, by their design, take more advantage of that. Some ethanol plants don't, and so it varies plant to plant. But in general, we don't want to get the corn too hot.
That's fantastic insight. When we talked a little bit about, pouring that bin out, getting the fines out, and then consistently checking and monitoring your grain quality. And over the past few years, I've noticed a lot of different companies that are promoting, I'll call them in-bin monitoring systems.
Yes.
Opinions, thoughts on something of that nature? Is that worth something for a farmer to invest in? Or are there certain ones that work in certain ways that are going to give us that assurance of quality that we're looking for?
The general answer to your question is yes, that it will be worthwhile to have some method of reading the temperature. But there's getting to be a lot of different in-bin monitoring systems. The most basic, just read temperature. And a rise in temperature at a location in the bin is indicative of spoilage. And that's been the traditional method that grain elevators have used. The limitation is that grain is a good insulator, and you can have a hot spot 10 feet away and not read it because the grain is a good insulator. So it isn't perfect. And you have to have cables spaced frequently enough that it generally catches all the parts of the bin. Often in a farm bin, the typical method is to put one down, not down the direct middle. Don't put it down the direct middle because you'll end up with it wrapped around the auger in the bottom, and then you'll be real unhappy. But put it off center, but somewhere near the center, so it reads, because that's the most likely place for spoilage. That will give you an indication. A figure 5 pattern, like on a dice, with one in the middle and then 4 on at outer locations, is probably better even for a farm bin. An elevator bin, a commercial bin, large, will have them probably spaced every 10 feet. And in there'll be cables for that. A more recent development is a relative humidity sensor along with the thermometer, along with the thermocouple on the temperature cable that reads relative humidity. And with relative humidity, it is easier to tell where there are moisture pockets in the bin, because relative humidity is proportional to the moisture. The relative humidity of the air around the grain is proportional to the moisture. There's a fixed relationship, equilibrium moisture content. And so if you read the relative humidity, you can tell where you have moisture variations in the bin. And that's a good thing because it's predictive of future hotspots and future problems. And with very big bins and changing temperatures, there can be moisture moving around in the bin, slow moving air currents in the bin that will cause some shifts in those moisture patterns. So the systems that have humidity sensing along with have a little more predictive capability. With a temperature set, you got to wait till you see it. If a thermocouple starts to rise, if you're Johnny on the spot and see a 2 to 3 degree rise, you can do something about it. But if you let it go, then it may have caused a certain amount of damage before you get there. So the tables with a relative humidity sensor, there are some that now have carbon dioxide sensing as well. When mold acts on grain, carbon dioxide is given off. And sensing that and measuring above the ambient air is about 4,000 ppm, I think, or something like that, of carbon dioxide. And if the carbon dioxide levels start to rise, that's pretty solid proof. There's fungus thinking about you. And there is a fungus working in there and is evolving carbon dioxide. Some bins have carbon dioxide sensors in the top center to just measure the relative concentration change of carbon dioxide in the bin with the fans off. With the fans on, it'll all go to the outside air. But that's good, and it's an early warning. It doesn't tell you where the spoilage is. The next level of refinement, as I understand it, is to have carbon dioxide sensing at individual points of the thermocouples within the bin. Now you've got some indication of not only where the moisture is, but what's going on. And with a certain amount of machine learning calculations, you can do a pretty good job of estimating how long you have to store the grain. How long can you leave it alone? Can you not? You have to turn the fans on. Do you not? How much dry matter have you lost? There are a lot of things. That's more certain. That's more applicable to these big bins at elevators, where you have 1 million bushels in a bin. And it's not very handy to be able to withdraw a hot spot. I find a hot spot in a 1 million bushel bin. What am I going to do with it? How do I get into it? Where do I put it? If I have to empty the bin to cool it off because it got away from me, where do I have 1 million bushel storage to put it, to not have to just dump it on a rail car and get it out of there? So there are levels of sophistication and cost with those temperatures, with those grain bin monitoring systems. Even simple temperature monitoring for a farmer bin, say less than 30 to 50,000 bushels, will be a big help. If you pay close attention, you can usually catch it before there's serious damage. And of course, go ahead.
We cover 23 states here at Beck, and so as we move east and south, we oftentimes get a considerable amount of ear molds that happen because of the environment. And so
relative humidities are higher. Mm-hmm.
Yep, mycotoxins, alpha toxins, things like that. Your opinion on storage or handling of that material?
Well, first off, typically mycotoxins are not a huge problem in corn belt corn. We have something called winter that kind of helps us out a little bit in that and gets everything cold and so forth. That's not to say we can't, because those fungi actually grow in the field during the growing season, and some growing seasons do promote it. Occasionally we'll get a really wet fall with a lot of rain, cool and wet. Eastern corn belt's a little more prone to that than we are here in Iowa, but it has happened. And there you get vomitoxin. If you get extended periods of cool and wet, when the corn is maturing or is filling, you tend to get vomitoxin, or that's the risk. If you have had drought stress and particularly stress period also at silk, that's when the fungus comes into the ear, and then hot weather in the fall and a little bit of rain, but particularly hot weather, then there's the aflatoxin risk. And of course, Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana and southern states have this problem kind of on a routine basis. They kind of rely on corn belt corn to be able to work that down to a level that is tolerable for whatever livestock they're feeding. For fat cattle, it's not so serious, but then when you get to chickens and poultry, then it gets more sensitive. This year should not. I've had my words crammed back at me several times on this sort of thing, but this year should not be a mycotoxin problem year. Now, if we continue to get rain and cool, cloudy weather, that could change. We're still not out of the woods yet. The combine's what tells the story. And so We're not out of the woods yet on that. But it doesn't look like this is a particularly high-risk toxin year, at least not in the central corn belt where I'm located. We should, if we follow good harvesting practices and so forth, we should be okay. That's not to say you can't, but the southern rust and the tar spot are not ear molds, and so that takes conditions when the grain has been more filled and developed to develop ear molds. And hopefully, if we continue to get air temperatures in the 70s, nice breeze, we'll get this corn dried down relatively quickly and won't have any issues of that happening. We haven't had it so far.
If we do see it flare up, what do we need to do from a drying or spilling perspective?
The fungi that produce toxins, either vomitoxin or aflatoxin, are not particularly aggressive storage fungi. That is, once the corn has been harvested, it's out of the field and in a bin, they're not particularly aggressive. However, you can screw it up if you want to, because if corn sits for an extended period of time at moderate to warm temperatures and it has been infected by field mold, it's going to be a little more likely for that mold to continue to develop in storage. So and this is where scouting comes in, scout the fields before you harvest to see if you have either the mustard green or the pink fungi. Those two are the general colors that are associated with aflatoxin and vomitoxin, respectively. If you have them, what you don't want to do is dry it slowly, because this is particularly when it comes to bin dryers, because in-bin dryers don't run at the high temperatures that your continuous do. Grain drying is moving very rapidly to favor continuous grain dryers, continuous flow dryers, and larger farms and continuous flow dryers. But bin dryers will tend to run at a lower temperature, and some people think that, well, if its corn is stressed and so forth, we ought to even turn the heat down and dry the corn more slowly. No. If it's been under stress in the field and shows signs of field mold, don't dry it. Don't turn the heat down and dry it slowly, because you have a warm corn sitting there waiting to be dried. And there have been instances where the fungi got worse, waiting for the dryer. Certain dryer systems are more prone to it than others, and so on. Most dryer systems have a stirring device in them. Most in-bin dryers, not all. There are some configurations of in-bin dryers that don't have a stirring device, but take the dry grain off the bottom and put the wetter grain on top. But anyway, there have been instances where the corn has been stressed in the field and therefore has fungi on it, that the fungi get worse before the drying fronts get to them, and we don't want that. So don't dry it slowly. If you have an in-bin dryer and there is clearly field mold on there, you might want to be sure that you're running 120, 130 degrees plus, rather than I've had a lot of people ask me, well, can I turn it down to 100 or 110 or 90? don't do that because it just makes a steeping chamber out of the wet grain. If the grain's in good quality, it's fine. But this year shouldn't be a problem. But who knows? We're not done yet, and we could have some rain and get some instances of field mold in some parts of the country.
Awesome. I appreciate that perspective. If you don't mind, a couple more minutes here, we'll switch to soybean.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a few comments from guys that have started soybean harvest already. They're seeing stuff already 8-9% moisture out there, and so
the last few days will do it.
Dealing with the some very dry conditions and some, I'll call it uneven maturation of the crop. So going through getting those 8-9% beans, and then you hit a slug that may be a low spot or just a very healthy spot, something that caused it. And then we got some butter beans, some different.
Yeah, you got some lima beans in there. Yeah.
And so from a soybean side, insights, recommendations that you would say as far as handling as well as storage can go?
Well, first of all, that we'll probably get almost every year, we get a week where soybean moistures just plunge because we've had hot weather. We had the hot weather last week. And I suspect that's what caused the instances in the earlier maturing, say the 1.8s and 2.0s and whatever that mature a little earlier in your trade territory, at least it would. I can understand why there would be some 8s. The complication this year is more unevenness than usual. And my recommendation there is, well, first of all, recognize that electric moisture meters will read the low side on mixtures of lima beans and normal beans. It'll read on the low side. It's hard to get them over 12%, and yet you know that those lima beans in there are more than 12%. And they'll store more than 12%. That is, they'll store like grain more than 12%. Generally, soybeans store about like 2% wetter corn. In other words, 12% soybeans, 14% corn. Neither one of them, that's a problem. But you get up to 14% soybeans, which is like 16% corn, and then you start to get some potential issues with it. But if you have mixtures of wet and dry, the best thing to do is aerate them right away, and don't worry about the outdoor air conditions. The over dry ones are too dry anyway. You're not going to hurt them. In fact, you'll probably gradually re-wet them. Re-wetting is a lot slower than drying, so it takes a lot more time to artificially put in moisture by air. But you don't have to worry about the dry air conditions or the wet air conditions causing spoilage. But I would aerate them pretty well to try to get them to even out, and they will. In a week or two, the mixtures will tend to come together. You'll never see them. You'll still see some oblong ones. You'll still see some oval ones, but they will even out more than they would in the grain tank. Because I think we may, depending on what the weather conditions next week are, we may get a little bit more of this. If we get 80 degrees next week, we'll have some more of that. Beans were hanging back a little bit in maturity, and they were staying green, and the corn, you could see the corn was coming down. It was coming down because of the rust, and the plants had just had it. Said, I'm screwed, I'm done for the year. But the beans were coming down slower. So this last week, and if we have another week of warm, I am guessing the beans will not crash, but they'll plunge in moisture. They'll go down quickly in moisture, and we'll see quickly changing leaf color. So, and that's when we'll likely see some very dry beans. If they're all that way, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Some folks advertise that they have an aeration fan controller that will turn on the fans in humid weather and put moisture in. Re-wetting is a lot slower than, so they may be able to get a point of moisture in. Folks need to be careful. Grain swells, and when it re-wets from the bottom up. If the fan blows up, re-wets from the bottom up. If the bin has a stirrator in, not a problem. Stirrator relieves the pressures and makes the thing go more evenly. If you re-wet from the bottom up, you get a certain amount of expansion in the beans, and in isolated cases, there have been bolt heads laying on the ground around the bottoms of bins. That's not a good sight. It's not comforting. And so you got to be careful about the stress you may put on the bins. My view is you're not going to put in a large amount of moisture. You may put in a point or two, and it may be worth it economically. That's a specific situation that you'll have to judge. But have a way to sample the grain so you know what's going on in there. And so there are systems that promote that, and I suspect they will put in a point or two of moisture, and of course that's 15 cents a bushel, but $10. It's about 15 cents a bushel at $10. So it's not small, and I understand there's a huge loss if you have 6 or 8% soybeans. That's a lot of money out of your pocket. I know that. Just be careful, and if you're doing that over a period of time, hoping the bin will take up moisture, be prepared to take some grain out of the middle periodically. Relieve the stresses by withdrawing some grain from the middle. That will be a big help in terms of helping your bin take the stresses that may cause. Not a good situation. If we have 70 or 80 degrees next week, we'll probably have more of it. You'll probably get more calls of it. If we can get those temperatures, we'll get beans down to 6 to 8%. All I can tell you is if you leave beans in the field, and I'm not arguing to do that because you also have split pods and beans laying on the ground. But if you leave beans set in the field and go through that initial rapid dry down stretch, and you get into deeper into harvest, like late October, November, December, the beans will wet up to about 18%, roughly, in the field. That's will be about the equilibrium with the air, 17, 18%. And in fact, they'll stay there. If you leave them all winter, they'll stay there, about there. But that's not something you want to do. But I'm just saying that the problem here is the initial press that gets them ready to harvest often overshoots the moisture. I understand that. And the only thing you can do is try to time it as carefully as you can. Aerate them if you've got mixtures of wet and dry. That's about it. I mean, you got what you got type of thing.
Doctor, you've been an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I've enjoyed this. I want to be respectful of your time here. Is there, it seems like with grain storage, it's a diligence to keep an eye on it, to know what you have going in, monitoring. Any closing thoughts that you'd want to let farmers out there know? These may be a few key things that you want to keep an eye on or look at, or anything that we didn't cover in this portion today that you would want to get out there.
Well, besides the temperature monitoring, and you really ought to look at even if you don't have temperature cables. If you have temperature cables, presumably they're set up so you can read them with a cell phone. A lot of them are set up so they have a cell phone connection and you can read them electronically. But if you don't have, you need to be looking at that grain every couple of weeks. Things change, and it is absolutely the change that matters. In other words, if you have grain that is at 40 degrees and you think that's a good temperature, if it goes from 40 to 43, that wasn't magic. It didn't happen by accident. Something generated heat to take it there. Maybe the fans were running, I don't know. But if they weren't running, and by the way, cover the ducts when you're not using the fans so that you cut down on the air currents moving inside. But if something changed, and that's where it's up to you to figure out what changed and what's going on in there. But monitoring the grain every couple of weeks will be very worthwhile. If you have, let's say, 50,000 bushels of soybeans in storage, at $10 a bushel, that's 500 grand. If you had $500,000 bills on a wire hanging in the bin, you'd probably look at them things every once in a while. And so we need to pay attention to what's going on and check it. If not you, somebody going in there or going to look and so forth. If you get in a bin of corn and you smell that musty smell that is kind of precedes corn changing color, you better be ready to act quickly, because something has already happened. Somewhere down in the bin, it has already happened. And that's where the more sophisticated monitoring systems start to pay back. Whether it will in smaller size bins is what a farmer needs to decide for themselves. But
Sure.
And on the economics and so forth of the situation. But continuous monitoring and then removing the center cores. I'm about running out of gas here. Try to do that in spring too. Take a center core out. Gives you a look inside.
Well, I want to thank you again. This has been very insightful. It's going to provide farmers throughout the entire United States with the insight and perspective of what's to come and ways that they can potentially avoid disaster and maybe capture a few more dollars on their end.